We'd like to get started here, so we'll start off with introductions by Connor Hagan, one of our law students.
Yeah, as Keith said, I'm 2L here. My name is Connor Hagan, and I have the pleasure of introducing this illustrious panel at our Space Policy Luncheon today. Along with that, I'm also the president of our Space Law Society here at CU, so this is really exciting for me. So starting with our panelists, we are first joined by Dr. Angel Abbud-Madrid, who is the director of the Space Resources Program at Colorado School of Mines. He is also the president of the Space Resources Roundtable, an international organization that addresses all aspects of space, lunar, asteroidal, and planetary resources. Next, we have Sophia Galleher. She's an attorney in Wilson, Sonsini, Goodrich, and Rosati's national security practice in Washington, D.C. Her practice spans a broad range of issues, but most notably spectrum allocation and access, as well as satellite technologies. Her work involves both representation before government agencies and transactional work where she assists clients in managing national security, regulatory, and business risks. Next, we have Professor Al Gasiewski, who is a professor of electrical and computer engineering here at University of Colorado and is the director of the NOAA CU Center for Environmental Technology. He's an internationally recognized expert in passive and active remote sensing of atmospheric, land surface, cryospheric, and oceanographic processes. And then finally, we're joined by Dr. Siamak, who is the co-founder and CEO at Kayhan Space, a company that brings next generation autonomy, satellite operations, and ensures space flight safety. Prior to Kayhan Space, Siamak led several software development efforts focused on collision risk assessment and mitigation, as well as autonomous onboard navigation. And finally, today's panel will be moderated by Dr. Keith Gremban, who is a research professor in the SMEAD Aerospace Engineering Sciences Department and also co-director of the Silicon Flatiron Spectrum Policy Initiative. He has over 30 years of experience in the defense industry, including DARPA, where he worked as a software architect and systems engineer. His current research interests are in RF modeling and dynamic spectrum sharing. So please join me in welcoming all of our panelists and Dr. Gremban.
Thank you, Connor. First, let's sit long enough, you gotta relog in. So start off with Space Luncheon with a little thought about space from Douglas Adams and the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So you've probably heard this, space is big. You just won't believe how vastly, hugely, mind-bogglingly big it is. But even though it's big, we're talking finite areas and we still have to worry about space sustainability. So in June of last year, Silicon Flatirons had an invitation-only roundtable on space sustainability. And topics we covered included things like interference with scientific applications, space resource management, licensing and regulations, and enforcement. And the outcomes report for anybody who's interested is up on the Silicon Flatirons website. The roundtable identified a number of important issues in maintaining space as a resource. And we'll be having a follow-up conference on that topic in June of this year. And this panel will kind of give you an introduction into the issues. So space is a shared resource. So at the roundtable last summer, Al brought up the concept of poisoning the public well. And this applies to science, industry, and national defense. And so tossing out to the panel what is needed from an international regulatory regime to prevent bad actors from poisoning the well. What kind of regulations are needed for us to cooperate and maintain space as a resource? Any volunteers to go first?
I can start. So yeah, as the introduction said, first of all, thank you for the attendance, and I think this is an important topic. I'm an engineer by education and by experience, so I look at this from the engineering perspective. And one of the, I guess, the key words in your question is bad actors, right? And I think that it's fundamental to answer this question to basically understand who is really the bad actor, right? Because right now, obviously, proliferation of commercial space industry has made this more difficult, and but it is becoming more and more difficult to basically track and keep custody of objects and really understand other objects' intentions, right? So we have objects that reported as the better satellite, but in fact they are not, right? I think there's a lot of technological efforts needs to be put in place in terms of being able to track and keep custody of objects that we think they are bad actors. Establish that first, and then move to basically the regular side to be able to really make proper judgments.
Sophia, I'll move down the panel this direction.
Yeah, I think something that we've looked at on the legal side is the development of the sort of in-space servicing, assembly and maintenance or manufacturing regime. I think that is happening at the FCC to a certain degree, and to what extent that can happen internationally. But where we really see a lot of the solutions coming from is the enabling of the economy around the space economy to help with some of that, making it sustainable and ensuring that those regulations are put together in a way that enables that innovation rather than makes it difficult for especially smaller companies that are innovating in this space to engage in the sustainability economy.
Okay. I come at this from the standpoint of looking at space as an environment. I direct our Center for Environmental Technology. The very letters VIR in environment mean a healthy place where life can occur, or business can occur, commerce can occur, etc. And I see two big risks to this environment. One of them is the ability to communicate with our anthropogenically built objects we put into space, our spacecraft. And that is to a great extent through the use of the radio spectrum. And the other is to ensure that they are able to fly without being damaged by nuts and bolts or other satellites. The second risk refers to the Kessler syndrome that was identified in 1978 by Kessler. And he identified it at the time as a result of a growth of around 13% per year in number of space objects. And this led to a very simple model, which suggested that as this density of objects increases, the collision rate amongst these objects can go as the square of that density. And at the time, he was looking at something like a few hundred launches per year of objects. We are now at about 6 times that rate of launches per year of objects. Now, mind you, these objects are not necessarily all as big as the old 5,000 ones, but nonetheless, that issue of losing access because we have too many little nuts and bolts and parts flying around is quite significant. And the other issue is spectrum. And with spectrum, I have quite frankly, a vested interest. I'm also chief scientist of a company called WeatherStream that's seeking to launch a small constellation of commercial weather satellites. And though we aren't the bad guys, we truly are weather satellites. So mistake us. But these satellites need the cleanest possible spectrum available for observing the Earth. This is the same level of cleanliness of spectrum that right now our NOAA, our National Weather Service, and other agencies around the world need for observing the Earth, for weather purposes. So these are two needs that have to be considered when we think about sustainability in space.
Great to be here in my alma mater here in Boulder. And I come here from the point of view of resources. And it's interesting from my point of view that location and the ability to look at the Earth from up above was the very first resource that was utilized in space. Telstar 1 was the first one that actually utilized that. And from that, we have had weather communications, weather forecasting, global communication.
I'm sorry to interrupt for the panel. If you guys could speak up a little bit. I know it's a little bit unnatural, but it's a big room.
Sure.
Thank you.
And so that's what being up there in space and communication satellites is getting at. And I think from the point of view of regulation and what the Outer Space Treaty and treaties after that have done is fantastic. I'm just seeing it from a point of view of more into the future, since I work in the field of resources. What's going to happen when we start looking at resources from the moon or communications around the moon and other places? What's going to happen then? Are these treaties enough, or are we going to have to modify them, which I think is very unlikely? So this is where other things are happening right now, with the Artemis Accords, where countries are coming together to define what's what has to be done in space so that we can all function there in this shared space. And so these are the things that we're looking at in the future in terms of what can be done to better behave everybody in space and utilize it in much better area.
So we're at the law school, so let's run with that theme a little bit. Let me toss this over to Sophia to start with. You know, you made a comment at the beginning here that space is kind of like the Wild West. So what kind of international regulations and so on are needed? And what's our path to get there?
Yeah, I think that, I'm here to listen as much as I am to talk, because I think one thing that's really missing in Washington DC right now, and spending some time, I was out in California last year, but there's a little bit of a communication gap between what's happening at the industry level and what regulators are doing. And I think it's very important for us to think about what's going on at the industry. And basically, I'm saying I don't have a great answer, but to think about what's going on at the industry level and have that inform either, domestic regulations or international regulations. And, we're in an area where one thing to keep in mind is, this conference has been talking about federalism. And one of the ideas that has come up is like, which values you want to lead. And the least common denominator is, going to be the regulator that leads. And we're in a space where if people don't like what's happening in their country, they'll just go to another country. So I think, making sure we get everyone to the table and bringing in some of the industry perspective and the engineering perspective to develop a framework where there's like a least common denominator that we can operate from.
Siamak, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I definitely agree with what Sophia says, and kind of bridging it further in terms of, again, what technology can do, right? So myself and a few others, we gave input to the National Space Council that came up with, I believe last year, the National Space Council National Space Debris Mitigation Plan. It's a mouthful, but if you haven't read it, please go read it. So there's very specific and technologically feasible recommendations that are put in there in terms of, obviously that's just a recommendation, right? It's not law yet. Hopefully it will be. For example, there's technology right now that will make your satellite more resilient in terms of impact. With nuts and bolts that are flying out there. There are very well researched shields that you can put in the ram direction of your satellite. So as stuff comes to hit, even if it renders your satellite, unusable, at least it doesn't shatter and you have some other pieces to result in the Kessler syndrome that was mentioned in the past. So I think there's definitely, we are in an era that is very exciting in terms of the commercial activities, but regulation have to catch up, right? Because, after a lot of debate, we were able to reduce the orbiting requirements from 25 years to 5 years. But still, 5 years is a very, very long time for something that is not able to change its course to stay in orbit. So I think, areas, and again, I'm going back to the National Space Council's activity, and it was a really good model that they came and they got a lot of useful inputs from researchers, from universities, from lawmakers, but also from industry, and put it all in that recommendation. So I think that's a good model to pursue.
Alan? Alan?
I was just going to say that with regard to space activities, satellites in orbit, neither orbits nor radio waves obey international boundaries. And so we need international cooperation. And I can't say international regulation because that I think is way beyond the horizon, but cooperation is probably the best thing we can hope for. And in this regard, there are two entities that are, I think, working in our favor that perhaps we ought to be paying attention to and building off of. In the area of spectrum, there's the International Telecommunications Union, which is, I believe, around 150 years old. It's headquartered in Geneva and was originally developed to effectively regulate telecommunication practices using wired systems. Of course, that became wireless in the early 1900s. And it's done a fairly effective job of managing international spectrum access under treaty. Now, treaties, of course, are voluntary, and any country can leave an international treaty at any point in time. But it is a voluntary activity that seems to work reasonably well, and I think building upon it is very important. With regard to space debris, I think what we have going for us is the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs, UNUSA, I believe it's usually called. And with UNUSA, there is language written regarding the fault of people who put up equipment in space that causes damage to other equipment. The problem is that in this language, fault is very hard to ascribe. First of all, when you have objects that may collide after perhaps years in orbit, even after they are disused. Second is, how do you ascribe fault on an international basis? You can sometimes barely do it within country borders. And third, if you do have a situation where this spins out of control and we have an exponential production of space debris, then fault becomes almost impossible because it becomes literally a chaotic distribution of objects up there. So, but those two bodies, I believe, are very important. I think we need to consider them and perhaps build them.
When we talk about regulations, kind of the flip side of that is enforcement. And given that it's an international exercise with multiple parties, how can we approach the enforcement issue? Is it carrot, stick? Any ideas on how we get bad actors to cooperate?
Probably using the good old way that international conflicts are done, name and shame of the United Nations.
I would have to agree with that. I think name and shame is going to be almost the only thing that works internationally, especially with international actors. But nationally, yes, I think that certain regulations put in place are reasonable. For example, 25-year deorbiting and ensuring that anything that you put up has the ability to be decisively deorbited within a reasonable period of time. That's quite a reasonable regulation. Right now, I believe it's voluntary. I don't think there is anything mandatory.
Yeah, again, there's no enforcement, right? So you can't really, I think, I'm gonna go back to, what I said earlier in terms of the, taking input from, industry. Obviously, I'm representing commercial industry here. I'm in general against the very heavy-handed regulations and enforcements because that's just gonna backfire, especially in a scenario like this that we don't have control of every actor, right? Chinese, Russians, they can do whatever they want if they don't like what we are doing. I think in this scenario like this, kind of a cliche of let the market win, decide and win. Kind of the carrots and stick approach is more suitable because Chinese operators, just like US operators, it is in their common interest to make sure their satellites don't hit Starlink satellites and vice versa. So there are certain common areas that we can naming and shaming is a good route to in terms of internationally to bring up the really bad and irresponsible actors. But also in terms of market incentives. For instance, just recently, Germany requires liability insurance for satellite operators. So I think that's a great step because now that creates an incentive that carrot and stick scenario for satellite operators to either eat the cost or get insurance to be able to handle in a case that their satellite results in that harm to other operators.
So just to run with that, over the summer, you talked a little bit about how conjunctions are managed. And it was kind of shocking to me, the lack of automation. Can you kind of talk about that a little bit? That was fascinating.
Yeah, Thanks for the opportunity for me to talk about my company. But yeah, I mean, I've worked in the field of conjunction assessment for many years, and historically, and even now, the conventional process is that the space systems, 18th Space Defense Squadron, they manage the space surveillance network and basically send out emails to satellite operators, whoever that has signed up for this free service. It's basically a text email that goes out and, hey, you have a conjunction with an object, okay, and good luck. Now, that used to work a few years ago, but obviously today, the numbers are staggering. So I'll give you an example. If you're this is from numbers from our customers. If you are a constellation of a little bit more than 100 satellites, say flying in a busy orbital shell close to Starlink, you get on the order of 60,000 conjunction alerts a week. So that is clearly not any human being cannot handle that, right? So that's why, this is what we are doing at Kayhan Space, that we believe in automation. There are certain things that you have to automate, and you have to utilize technology to be able to really manage kind of maneuvering around objects. Speaking of maneuvering, that's another can of worms that not every satellite operator and satellite is maneuverable, which is a good area for, I think, regulatory activities.
Further comments or on to the next? Okay. So one of the things that's been occurring is we don't realize how much of our science applications, such as Earth's observation, optical astronomy and radio astronomy and so on, depend on access to space, right? And so how do we resolve commercial applications? We provide the hundreds of satellites to provide us communications and so on with science applications, which by their nature are kind of hard to economically, hard to characterize economically. You want to start off on that one, Al?
Yeah, and I want to correct something that is commonly, I believe, a mistake of some of my colleagues regarding our application of passive microwave radiometers is something called weather science. It's not weather science, it's weather service. The fact that you all flew here this week safely and you knew the weather was going to be nice, that is a service. It's not science anymore. It's something we all depend upon. Reinsurance, agriculture, transportation, defense. And so I think it needs to come out of this domain of just plain old science. Now, my radio astronomy colleagues, they are truly doing science. They are inspiring us on, again, almost like a monthly basis with something new that comes out of the radio astronomy community about objects that tell us about our existence in the universe. I don't know how to put a price on that. To me, that's just so valuable because it inspires me. I think it inspires a lot of people. Maybe it doesn't inspire everybody. But, that leads to a lot of new developments as well. Radio astronomy has led to the development of radio detection techniques that are now used for our telecommunication systems and making very quiet radios. And many, many other disciplines as well, radar, for instance. So the spin-offs from it, you just can't discount those either. Now, how do we balance them? It's a challenge because in some sense, even the weather applications that I talked about, they would benefit so much from satellite cross-links and downlinks that can get that information down to the ground quickly, be able to forecast our weather. So there's a bit of a, what I call dependence on each other to some extent.
Can I jump in after that? I'm sorry.
Sure.
John Chapin, National Science Foundation and the Electromagnetic Spectrum Management Unit. We are the stewards of radio astronomy. So I want to say that radio astronomy is also a service that every one of you uses every day. You may not know this, but the Earth wobbles as it rotates.
That's right.
And the measurement of that wobble is critical to make sure that your GPS stays accurate, because the orbiting GPS satellites don't wobble when the Earth wobbles. And the way we do that is we measure fixed distant emitters called pulsars, and we measure them continuously all the time. And that creates the Earth reference frame, which is then fed into the corrections for the GPS system. So there's definitely a service that will be significantly negatively impacted if the radio astronomy system is not able to do its job.
Yep, thank you for that correction, John. The VLBI network, very important.
I just want to add to that, thank you for that service, because we pull Earth orientation parameters daily. Without them, we cannot do anything, right? Cannot do the precision that we are operating. We can have hundreds of kilometers of error if you look at like geo, if you don't correct for the bobble of the Earth.
So anybody else want to comment on that one?
Well, we just have to agree that, just like in telecommunications, satellite science, commercial applications and defense have got along for quite some time. As we start looking further, and I see it, for example, on the moon. Now you have, this year long, you're gonna have probably 5 or 6 landers there, and scientists are not feeling too good about that. So we have to understand now that science can provide us the important information for the commercial uses of other planetary bodies. And defense is realizing that these assets have to be defended. And so you're gonna have to have these 3 components getting along, just like they have been doing in low Earth orbit as we go for further investigations.
Kind of along this, come on. There we go. So one of the other interesting things that came up in our roundtable over the summer was the issue of dark and quiet skies. So we've talked about radio astronomy. Optical astronomy is similarly affected by all the reflections off the thousands of satellites that are in orbit. And one of the things that we brought up was, I thought was very interesting, was consideration for indigenous cultures for whom the stars are part of their culture. And that's being interfered with by the number of satellites in space and so on. And I don't know, you had a couple of interesting thoughts on that.
No, that's true. More and more as these mega constellations are occurring, and now that we go into the moon, indigenous people are saying, look, especially the moon, it's been an object of adoration for every culture since the beginning of humanity going around it. And now you have things like last year, people trying to get some human remains buried there, and the Aboriginal people from Australia and other places reacted very negative to this. So we have to be very conscious of these type of problems. A great example of how science and commerce can get along is Mauna Kea. You have probably the best observatories in the world, but it's also a sacred land for the Hawaiian people. And they have been able to coordinate efforts. The original people see the advantage that they have in their culture, but we're also trying to respect what's happening in there. And I think it's the same way that we should go as we start polluting our skies and other places in the solar.
Sophia?
Weigh in. I think I thought a lot about this question when I saw it, and I think it's incumbent upon the regulators to make sure that we're giving a seat at the table to those voices. Like, I don't think that it's very hard for us, me in a position of a regulator, to make that argument on behalf of Indigenous communities. So our responsibility is to ensure that they're at the table so they can, those communities can put forward their own opinion and build their alliances and build their, it's their responsibility to build their alliances. And it's our responsibility as regulators to make sure we're listening.
Anyone else weigh in?
I just wanted to, I agree, and I think there is this is a very important area, and like anything else, like any new technology, there's gonna be concerns. And everybody, for instance, talks about Starlink as the elephant not in the room in these type of conversations. Although I have we talk to them a lot.
Could you speak up a little bit?
Oh, sure. I think they are very responsible in a way. And we can talk about it when it comes to conjunctions issue. But again, there are technological solutions to these kinds of concerns. For instance, the dark skies. we can have regulations that, in terms of the material that is used on, on the nadir side of the spacecraft, or in terms of, the reflection of the radio waves, or also optical telescopes, it doesn't interfere, right? So those are, and I think the new generation of Starlink satellites do have particular coding underneath in the nadir side of the satellite to minimize at least the. I'm not saying that's a perfect solution, but as long as there's communication and there is awareness from the industry side about these concerns, I think, I'm sure there's going to be, bad apples or like bad actors, but overall, I think industry recognizes that press about the burgeoning new space industry is not good for anybody.
So we brought up the issue of work on other planetary bodies, and I'd really like to toss out to Angel, but one of the topics you see in the news is mining asteroids and so on, and the trillions of dollars worth of rare earth elements and so on that are on those asteroids. And I know you've got some thoughts on that.
Sure. Yeah, it's unfortunate for the space resources community that this talk is going around. And it was introduced by companies in the 2012, 2013 time. When they were saying we're going to go out there and bring platinum and gold and we're going to become trillionaires. That is not going to happen. Let me tell you. We knew it back then. They thought they had the money, but their businesses collapsed. And it's important to know that any resource that you're going to use in space is to be used in space, not to bring it here to Earth. We have plenty of resources here on Earth. We have literally just barely scratched the surface. And it's not economically to do it out there. But resources in space have the possibility to enable all sorts of new exploration, new commercial activities, and truly change the way we've been doing things in terms of providing the propellant and the human consumable and the like. So be very careful with those headlines from the news. And I know that there's a Psyche mission going to metallic asteroid. Now we're talking quadrillions of dollars. That's not going to happen.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
I think a couple of issues. Of course, there are going to be certain countries that get to these asteroids first and start using those resources. And the question becomes how do you guarantee that the non-incumbents have some shot at that as well? That's, I think, an issue that has to be addressed. Another issue, though, and I fully agree with you, that this material will be used in space. Obviously, best location for it. And it's got some potential to be used in space for extremely consequential ways for life on our planet. And this has to do with the potential to reverse some of the climate change that have been causing over the last, well, I guess some people would say 150 years, but I would say certainly over the last 30 years. And we're continuing to cause as well. And that is, there are a few possibilities for geoengineering, which is itself is a whole nother topic that ought to be addressed someday by a Silicon Flatirons event. But let's just say for a moment that maybe we can do it. One of the ways of doing it is potentially to shade the Earth. And in shading the Earth, those materials have to come from space. They're not going to be launched from the planet. They're going to be already in space. It's just far more economical to do that. And so I think we do want to pursue that field of asteroid mining and lunar mining and lunar manufacturing in some reasonable way, because we might need it.
Absolutely. Actually, there's a project called the Planetary Sunshade Project that is looking at what would happen if you can selectively shade the Earth to do that. This is absolutely has very important consequences. You don't want to overdo it and then cool the whole place. But that's right.
Well, I have a saying too. If I can bring this up, please. With regard to you don't want to overcool the place. Getting back to our satellite constellation for weather forecasting, our meteorologists usually call these measurements OBS. My attitude is, if you don't have the OBS, don't turn the knobs.
Right. Another good saying that puts it in the well.
There we go. Two from Al. Okay, so we're just about time to move it over for questions, but I got one more question I want to toss out to the panel. And that is, we've talked about regulation and the dangers of collisions and so on. So what happens if access to space disappears? What are the consequences? I'll go ahead and start on your end, Siamak.
Sure, I mean, if the access to space disappears, I mean, that's existential to our being, right? I mean, as a species, we have always, the reason we have all these technologies is because we have always looked at heavens and wondered what it is and, how can we get there? And as a result, we have built all these technologies. And, going back to previous conversation is that, and I take responsibility as a member of a space industry. I don't think commercial space industry or in general space industry is doing a good job communicating the value of space and value of exploration to general public. We heard some services about Earth orientation parameters and such, but also GPS constellation. Probably some of you know, some of you don't know. One of the main outputs of the GPS constellation is not locationing, it's time. The fact that your cell phone has such a precise time and that can be synced with everybody else's cell phone and internet's time is because of the existence of the GPS. And in fact, the GPS constellation resulted in for us to positively measure the theory of general relativity because we had to change the frequency because the satellites are farther away from the gravity well of the Earth and the clock runs faster. So we faster, yes, because when you're closer, you run slower. So I mean, there are intertwined kind of science and technology discovery here that obviously, I mean, anywhere that we want to go, obviously I as a profession focus on LEO, we have to pass from the LEO, lower Earth orbit. And if we mess it up there, then that'll be very hard to convince the Congress to budget for another, exploration mission that's going to go through this wall of debris.
Sophia?
Yeah, I think to a little bit echo, some of the things you're just saying is ensuring that we can articulate the benefits to people that are not in, this room and in this space. I talk to, people on this, I wouldn't say the street, my parents. I talk to my parents and I tell them, that I'm working in this area. And they're just like, I think a lot of people are like, oh, that's cool, that's fun, disguise. And people don't really see it as affecting their everyday life. And it's really hard to regulate when people aren't seen as something directly affecting them. So I think articulating the benefits. And then the flip side of that is, what does it look like if access to space disappears? And, the real risk of, is it disappearing or there's suddenly going to be gatekeepers where there's a few people with a lot of money who are controlling that access? And I think that's a separate question of what it looks like when it disappears and what does that mean?
Yeah, I think that if you eliminate space activities, you bring civilizations to its knees. And I think the public does not realize that, like you're saying, because they just don't see how much we're depending on. So it's imperative that we educate the public. And if it doesn't work, maybe movies can do it. But there's a way that you can tell them how important that is. And this is a great way to highlight why science and commerce is important. It's not just about we're discovering great things out there, but at some point the public is going to get very tired of just spending their taxes on this. But now tell them how important it is to their everyday lives, and then things change and the attitude will change.
Well, some of us are old enough to remember the 60s and 70s, and our lives would go back very much to the 60s and 70s. And, so I can point out 3 examples. Well, certainly we all know one famous person who would be very disappointed if access to space suddenly ceased. That person definitely wants to put people on other planets. Then there's me, who's not so famous, but would really like to see better weather forecasts. And many of you who, of course, remember the weather forecasts of the early 1980s, where the weather person would be up there and we'd be lucky if the weather forecast was correct for the next day. Yeah, so those are just two examples. And then one more that I think is quite important, that is, if we really lost access to space, we'd have one of two major modalities of international communications that we would lose. Now, back before fiber optics, back again in the early 1980s, our international communications were effectively by satellites. And Intelsat was the major entity that managed those activities, those communication links. Fiber optics, of course, supplanted a lot of that. And so can you say, well, we can do without space international communications? I would say no. Not in this era where just a single ship anchor could disrupt our international communications, which we just can't afford to have happen today. So yes, many concerns around that.
Great. Well, thank you. So I guess we're time to move over to questions. So, student?
Yeah, student, I have a question about the public imagination space. You know, I'm a layperson, super fascinated by it. I think it's clearly super important, but I think, you know, given that the American public can agree on scientific topics like climate change and that the leader of the world's most important private space company is the most divisive person in the world, I see that as big headwinds towards space and people's favorability of it, getting at the last question asked. So are there any potential solutions for that?
Wants to take a shot at that?
Yeah, I mean, it's, I don't know if I have the right answer. It's a good question, and I would say more communication, right? More communicating. The only way that you're gonna overcome the wrong perception is to communicate the right the outcome, right? I think, and as an industry, we are not doing a great job communicating. You know, I go to a lot of space conferences and you end up seeing the same people over and over and over again. We don't do a good job out there doing outreach to public.
And to just add to that, I think more interdisciplinary communication. I think the importance of having, conversations like these where you have different perspectives. I also went to a space conference and it felt very exactly what you're saying. You kind of, I was coming from the outside, you definitely want more people in the room and giving, a message to what's going on in this area.
And if it doesn't work, nothing like feeling it. Everybody gets together and say, we're gonna turn off communication for 15 minutes. And then turn it on again, people will say, all right.
With regard to this individual HR head, I believe you were referring to, I think many people would be interested in seeing a human on Mars. I would.
Another question?
Sure.
Hi, Nick Baraka. I'm at Capella Space, commercial remote sensing radar company. I have a question about mission authorization and an attempt to sort of link from a theme downstairs about the overarching sort of entity, sometimes smaller entities with complicated regulations and sort of a patchwork. I know that there's novel activities that have to go to many different agencies in order to get authorization. Sort of curious whether you think that space regulatory affairs should be consolidated. There are some proposals that have it just under the Office of Space Commerce, some split between FCC and Office of Space Commerce. So curious about who do you think should be the best regulator for space?
I would like to invite all the space companies in the room to weigh in on that question because, I think we are all operating in that same space where we're like, who is the regulator? And I don't think we've really come up with a good answer. Obviously, there's a spectrum management, aspect, but I really encourage companies that are either in California or Colorado to recognize if you're not in front of the regulators or you're not taking these issues under advisement as you're developing your business development strategy, someone else is. So I think it's, you guys are the one who the regulators and the regulations are affecting, and it's important for, putting your question back on you.
I would say the FCC is a natural entity to double down on what they do with regard to regulation for frequency management in space. I double down, of course, do that in conjunction with business as well, but bolster their capabilities in those areas. their human infrastructure, so to speak. Now, with regard to objects in space and launch and deorbiting and so many other things, I don't think they're really the right agency for that. And I think somehow or another we need a new agency that perhaps is a spin-off of NASA to do that. It still could be a federal commission, but I really think we're missing that.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for being a great operator. You know, they are one of the really, responsible operators in terms of making sure they're not causing issues to others. So, but yeah, I definitely think there needs to be some streamlining in the process because there are a lot of gaps. At the moment, we deal with FAA, FCC, and Office of Space Commerce, right? And it was this administration's previous, their first term that the SPD3 came out, and the Space Directive 3 that directed the commercial space traffic management handled by the Department of Commerce. That there was a lot of back and forth studies and such, but we just need to act, right? I don't know which agency needs to handle it, but yeah, I share the same interest with you that yes, there needs to be more streamlining, because if there's more streamlining, then things will not fall through the cracks that they do now.
Can I add one more thing to that? The FAA would seem to be a natural entity to continue
I think so.
on, but space and air are so different that I think that you'd end up with two distinct departments within that organization that you'd almost need a third. So I'm not quite sure the FAA is relevant.
Let's do back. Dean?
Hi, good afternoon. Laura Marion with Amazon Project Kuiper, so representing the impending elephant that is in the room. So my question to the panel is, what are some of the inputs or contributions that industry can make to this discourse that we're not yet doing? What do you need to see from industry?
From industry. Well, certainly commitments to maintaining space through deorbiting. I think that's number one. And commitments to maintaining spectral access to the various services, science or weather services, for example, that need that. Commitments to collaborating in coexistence basis, well, let's use the initial term, sharing basis with the other entities that are already using space for communications, internet, for example. So those would be starts, I believe.
Siamak, I saw your head nodding there.
Yeah, I think please bring your thoughts and things that you think ought to be discussed to the table with the industry partners. I forget if Project Kuiper is signatory to SSC guidelines or best practices, Space Safety Coalition best practices. I think if you guys are.
The conversations were very close.
Yeah. So I mean, honestly, I think that's one of the really good examples of where the industry came together and said, okay, what are the best practices? Like speaking about regulation and stuff. I think the only way really for the regulations to stick is if it comes from industry. Like we agree collectively that this is a good thing. And yeah. So.
I was in London earlier this week.
Okay.
Let's take one last question.
Got one more question, go ahead.
In a market, it would be natural for incumbents to defend their position by creating barriers to entry and making it harder for others to come in. But some of the things that the incumbents have are things like best practices, patents, knowledge. Do you guys have a mechanism for sharing that with new entrants who you would, naturally try to keep out? But if you would share that or, license your patents for free or something like that, would make it easier for them to do deorbiting and know where everybody is and otherwise be nice people, that you don't necessarily have those incentives for earth-based ventures.
Anybody want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, I'll take a shot at that. I think there is, yes, there's definitely, there could be efforts to keep the incumbents, keep the newcomers from gaining more access to the market. But I think there is enough diversity in the industry right now. For instance, let's talk about the orbiting and propulsion capabilities, right? Propulsion capabilities and the technology has come a long way right now. So, and there are a lot of new companies that are doing propulsion, building propulsion capabilities for small and big satellites that can maneuver an object, to a particular location on Earth. That's just one example. I think there is enough diversity in the industry that not a single company maintains all the cards, so to speak. When it comes to launch, that's a different story, right? SpaceX is basically the only company right now that does rideshare missions. Rocket Lab has started, and we'll see what Glenn is going to be capable of doing. But I believe launch is a bottleneck right now when it comes to technology sharing. But in terms of safe practices, it's public, it's out in the open. There are a lot of research papers that people can go and build, and that's my opinion.
Sophia, did you have any thoughts on that?
The one thing I would, maybe add is that there's this sort of maybe forcing some opening up of companies, which that is well beyond I think that's much for the companies to answer, but keeping an eye on what the big providers are doing and how there might be some like spectrum grabs going on in private negotiations, and making sure that, there's not one big company that's using its bargaining power to, take away access to spectrum or controlling spectrum. And those are things that I think are a little bit more in our control that we can follow, whether that falls under an antitrust issue or, those are things that I think we should be keeping an eye on.
Thank you. How did
Well, certainly, Northern technology is improving quite rapidly, and there are companies that are building business models around that. And, there could be some new innovation in that area as well. I can't speak for the companies because they're not here, but I can suggest one thing, and that is when it comes to keeping space clean, municipalities put public trash cans all over cities and empty them. They take care of their cities. They work in collaboration with the public in some sense. And here's an opportunity really for NASA to help bootstrap that industry by working with them and making sure that technology its development is supported, that at least to the extent of IP limitations go, is available widely, and that would just help the process.
I want to put stump on that because as the growth of the industry is not going to slow down, it's just speeding up. This idea of removing debris, especially, we are not going to remove everything, right? Things that are like a bolt size, but removing large objects that are really consequential if they hit something, that are going to basically generate another few thousands of objects. And that is technologically feasible. There are companies that are trying to do that, and absolutely, I agree. That's something that I think should be in the top agenda of the NASA or Congress to fund these activities.
Let me add one more thing.
Sure.
From the space resources point of view, somebody's trash is somebody's really good assets. And so why burn this material in the atmosphere when you already have spent $5,000 per kilogram to send it up there when you can recycle it? Just like we do here on Earth. And like you said, there's companies already working on this type of thing. Let me just mention an example. Astroscale is working on how to grab the material, selling it to nano racks that is going to tear it apart, selling it to Siamak industry that is going to melt it and provide a pellet for Neumann space to actually use it as a propellant or for structures in space. So think recycling, just like here in Boulder, we're very fond of doing it. I think recycling space.
Great. Okay, well, with that, let's thank the panel. I'd also like to thank Brad for making all of this possible.